Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Logan, hey,
Hey, how's it going,
I
Harrison?
was getting a little bit of lag on my end. Good, how about you?
Oh, okay.
Are we good?
Is is it better now?
Turned off my Wi-Fi. You're,
Okay.
I think we're good now.
Okay. Yeah, that seems good. Yeah.
Cool. Great to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining in. Welcome to another episode of Meeting and Reading. My name is Logan Esterling, and my guest this week is Harrison Lindsey. He plays second oboe in the National Symphony Orchestra, and he previously held second oboe with the San Diego Symphony. He's performed with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, the Seattle Symphony, and the Pittsburgh Symphony. Thank you so much, Harrison, for joining me today.
Yeah, of course. Glad to be here. Excited to talk some reads.
Yeah, me too. So let's just dive into it. I guess what is your let's start with cane brand and gouge that you use.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I used to play in the San Diego Symphony, and one of the perks of being located in Southern California was I could just head on the 5 and drive up to RDG, where they allow you to
Yeah,
actually, you know, sit in front of the huge tubs of cane and pick out, scour through each piece, and really have some high standards. So, I would go up every other month or so,
wow,
and
okay,
I would pretty much have as high of standards as I allowed myself to, and
yeah,
be okay leaving there with maybe 10 tubes that looked great, just because I was pretty sure, pretty dialed in at that point, what I was looking for. So that was mostly the RGO cane they have.
nice.
Um, in more recent times, I've actually been kind of like just now hitting the end of my stocked supply from my days in San
Okay,
Diego. So,
nice.
very sad to say, now I'm in DC, on the other coast, and don't have the luxury of going to pick it out. So at this
Yeah,
point, I've been ordering some Regati cane from France.
okay,
In general, I stick with the Regati and Pisoni. That's been pretty good for me. Um, and I guess just a quick description of what I'm looking for.
yeah,
I like a nice golden color, like most people describe, but while in the past I used to always go for the absolute hardest, densest,
mm.
like I don't know, sometimes you find those pieces of cane that are like steel, you try
Yeah,
to
yeah,
you're trying to fold it when you make the reed, and
hmm
sometimes it just doesn't want to go. At this point, I I'm really tending towards cane that just folds easily. I don't want it to be soft and mushy and just kind of like mealy and grainy. I want a really nice tight grain and that golden color. But some of the cane that's like neon yellow, while I used to really cherish that,
yeah,
now I find it just a bit harder to work with. Um, and so I go for cane that's just a little bit, like maybe one or two notches off of the absolute hardest, densest stuff I can find.
nice, nice. I like that. We
And
actually
your
have
other
a.
question was, oh, what you said,
Oh yeah, we
cane and
had.
gouge.
Yes, yeah,
Just real quick. So for
yeah.
gouge, I have two furlough machines with the standard J plus 2 blade, and then I
Nice.
have an Inaletti gouging machine that I had asked to be set up with thicker sides. So
Okay.
right now, that's actually what I've been using, just because it's a lot easier to adjust than the furlough. And I've been taking some of this quarantine time where we don't necessarily have concerts, to revisit a lot of my axioms and customs.
Yeah.
So now I'm experimenting right now with thinner gouge, and
Okay.
I'm achieving that on the Inaletti, going to about 0.58 in the middle.
Nice. Okay.
Um, so
That's awesome.
that's
Yeah, I
where I'm at
definitely
right
want
now.
Yeah, I want to ask you more about that. But we had one submitted question just now. What are signs that a piece of cane is soft and unusable?
That's a good question. I think one can tell a lot about the what the final read would end up being like by the bark. And
Yeah.
some absolute deal breakers for me are bark that has ridges. If it's nice to be in a well-lit place when you're examining the tubes, and you do really want a nice shine. Sometimes there's some dirt and dust caked on there, and it can be a really
Yeah.
nice piece of cane under the dirty exterior finish.
Yeah.
But I would say any sort of ridges or the bark where if I took my nail and kind of pressed into it gently, if it left a dent in the bark that didn't, if it just left a dent, that would
Yeah.
strike me as material that just wasn't of the right hardness. So
Nice. Yeah, I also
yeah,
look for those little tests. And one thing I also do is sometimes I'll even like either wipe off, my tube cane before I really sort it, or even lightly run it under water and rub it off,
yeah,
just to
yeah,
get the truth behind all the dirt on the outside. Yeah.
exactly.
Um,
I just getting a nice towel and wiping it down will do
yeah.
the job. Just also really quickly, I do pay some attention to the wall thickness of the
Okay.
tubes.
Yeah.
And so generally speaking, as you look perpendicular and you're kind of seeing the tunnel vision, I guess, of the tube,
Mm.
um, if you can kind of study the very end and the grain structure of where exactly it was chopped, that can be a pretty good visual guide. But the most important thing, and everyone says this, but it's you just got to make thousands and thousands of reads. I think.
Yeah.
I think. Um, so
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah. Okay, cool. So next setup stuff is staple and shape.
yeah. So this is another area where I've been just doing a lot of experimentation, and
Yeah.
um, at this point, I am using Guercio staples
Okay,
in
nice.
46th length. My orchestra plays at A442,
Okay.
and as a second oboist, as we all know, our low notes can tend to, unless you have that perfect golden reed, our low notes
Yeah.
can tend to sag more than some of the other registers. And so for me, 46 or just a shorter staple than 47 um, is really helpful just to get the scale to line up better for where I need it. I'm actually pretty interested in venturing into the 45
Yeah.
range. And anyway, so much of playing the oboe, and I guess especially second oboe, is just working to avoid flatness, working to play in a manner that's relaxed and settled. And this is something I'd like to get to a little bit later too. But
Yeah.
um, there's many ways to approach it. You can either start narrowing and narrowing and narrowing the reed, and leaving more cane on it.
Mm.
But ultimately, if what we're going for is ease and just a generosity of vibration, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
I prefer to kind of get the reed feeling comfortable and then adjust the staple length as necessary. So
Nice.
so right now it's the Guercios in 46. I'm using the G1, and I'm also alternating between that and there's an AM Albrecht-Meyer model
Okay.
that I've been trying out. Um, yeah,
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I've tried
that's
the G1. It's a Glotan copy, I think.
I
Um,
I think so.
yeah.
Um,
I've
yeah.
had some good results with the 46 as well. Um, some people like argue that a 46 staple might have less depth than a 47 staple. Do you find that to be true? And if so, like how do you adjust for that?
Um, I would say if all other variables were equal, sure,
Mm, mm,
lengthening the overall tube or pipe or whatever you want to call it would bring some sort of depth into the equation. But oftentimes, I'm not looking for my low C. We all want depth in terms of sound, but
mm.
I guess I feel like there's so many ways to balance that out. For instance, I'm using a much wider shape than I ever did when I used the longer staples, and Um, to some degree, it's unfortunate we're cursed in a sense
Yeah.
to have to obsess over all these tiny details and these ever
Yeah.
the interplay of these many variables making reads. But on the other hand, it does give us such control, such ability to achieve those little setup nuances that'll put us in the right position. So
Yeah.
whatever depth I might be missing from the 46 tubes, or even when like I mentioned, I want to check out 45 and see maybe I could go on an even wider shape then,
Yeah.
allow me to scrape the reed more.
Yeah.
I think it's a good question, but there's so many variables that come into
Yeah.
play. So
Yeah. Yeah. That totally makes sense. I
yeah,
actually earlier this year experimented with some 45 glotans with like an RDG 2, which is,
yeah.
crazy wide.
What
Um,
was your experience like there?
I'm still struggling to get it up to pitch, but I still come back to it every once in a while just see if I can make something work.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
uh I think of I kind of draw on my experience with the English horn a lot of the times because
yeah,
the English horn in the US where most people are accustomed, excuse me, to using wire.
hmm
The reeds are physically much bigger than the oboe reeds, and it seems like everyone's a little less tied to one standard staple length or tube length or shape.
yeah,
Seems like there's just a bit more room for individuality when it comes to the English horn. And another thing I always miss about the English horn when I'm playing oboe is just how generous the reed feels, how
yeah,
generous the sound feels as I think a result of the size of the reed. And on the English horn, the problem usually for me at least is getting the pitch down enough. So
yeah,
so that
yeah,
that just tells me that maybe pitch, um, maybe the shaper tips, maybe the staple length can all be a bit more flexible than at least I once thought or I was once willing to go. Um, so
yeah.
yeah,
I love that.
I don't know if that rings true with you about the English horn. I know you play a fair amount.
Yeah, no, I totally agree though. I think there is a lot more individuality. And I think a lot of us are just kind of forced into finding what works for us, right?
Right.
Whereas with Obo Read, sometimes we're given like this prescription of this is what you have to do, rather than
Yeah.
approaching it like, let's figure out what works.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
so I love that mindset. Yeah. And what about shape?
Cool.
What shapes are you using?
Yeah, so let's see. I for most of my time in school was using the Mac Pfeiffer copies that they sell at RDG,
Okay,
the kind of
nice.
dark metal, same as the general Mac copies that people use. Um, but I had great success with the shape and liked it. Some of the things I look for and I think are just um, bare minimum for choosing a shaper tip would be the ability to consistently get tight sides when you tie. I guess that's a topic for discussion too,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
people put a lot of different emphasis on exactly how the blades lie against each other, if they're slipped or not. But for me, I think the reed being airtight, and I think for most people would agree that airtight reed just is one way to eliminate some of the
yeah,
variables with pitch.
yeah.
So at this point, I am using the Nagamatsu like
Okay.
line of shaper tips, and primarily I've been using the OB. It's similar to the RDG tips. They kind of have a lineup that range from narrow to wide,
Gotcha.
and they go OA from narrowest to widest. They go OA, OB, 0, 1, 2. And so I was for the longest time using the one from narrowest shape. But I actually from a colleague of mine, I picked up
Hmm.
a sort of bootleg one-off Nagamatsu shaper tip that was kind of
Okay.
a prototype model that's quite a bit wider than the OB. It might be closer to the 2, or maybe even that
Wow,
Gilbert
okay.
2 you were using.
Yeah.
And um, yeah, partly with my recent addition to my sort of oboe family of getting this Menig oboe.
Yeah.
Um, and some of my recent reed experiments and just this general madness of this past year.
Yeah.
I would have never asked to be kept away from the concert hall stage for this long, but
Yeah.
um, when, life gives you a situation like that, I've been taking it as an opportunity to really experiment. And so, like I said, going with shorter in the staple length, um, using this oboe has allowed me, they both tend to sit higher in pitch than my older instruments and older shaper tip did. So, or older tubes would. So now I
Yeah.
feel more able to use a generously wide shaper tip. And
Nice. Yeah,
that
that's
was a
awesome.
lot there, but I'll just quickly
No,
add
yeah.
one of the reasons I switched to the Nagamatsu shaper tips is the metal is extremely high quality Japanese steel
Mm.
from what I understand, and the actual shaping facet of the shaper tip is quite wide compared to some. I know, at least in my experience, the shaping on tips where the shaping surface is quite a bit narrower, I
Yeah.
think it makes it quite a bit easier to accidentally um, accidentally sort of lean the razor blade over to one side. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, the metal seems like it's lasting forever. The shaping facet and design is really comfortable. And yeah, that's what I've been sticking with for a while. For anyone that maybe is used to the slightly narrower, more standard shaper tips, I'd say the OA or the OB in the Nagamatsu line would be a pretty good fit. Yeah. Can I add
Nice.
one other quick little
Yeah, go
tidbit
ahead. Yeah.
about my shaping technique, which
Yeah, please. Yeah.
no one taught me this, and I don't think it's standard or even necessarily the best way to do it, but I actually use um, like general utility box cutter blades to shape my
Okay,
reeds.
nice.
And the actual sharp edge is quite a bit wider than a normal razor blade. So, um, I can just use one per piece of cane.
Yeah.
Whereas when I was shaping with gem razor blades, which are razor sharp and can give you a really nice edge, but they would, for me, dull quite a bit more easily, especially because they're so much thinner.
Yeah.
These are like really heavy duty, thick gauge um, blades that just go in a box cutter. And for me, the maybe the what you lose in you know razor sharpness, you gain in it not bending first of all, and the larger cutting surface just seems a bit
Yeah.
less wasteful, and I just get better shaping results on it. So I'm
Nice.
not going to fix what isn't broken. So
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll have to try that
mhm.
at some point. I have some lying around, but yeah, I'll have to try that later today or something.
Yeah, give it a try and let me know.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I've heard some good things about the Nagamatsu shapes. And I'm really interested to try some of them. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was wondering
just
if,
real
yeah,
oh,
go
just
ahead.
real quickly, my first
Yeah.
I was just going to add my first interaction with them was on the English horn. They're a pretty
Mm,
common. I think the one is a pretty ubiquitous English horn tip.
okay.
And I used one and I noticed the metal was great and I tried the oboe once. So
Nice. That's awesome.
yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your new oboe and kind of how you came to getting that oboe and how that journey has been, adjusting to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually sort of pondering that subject this morning and writing down, collecting some of my thoughts because in a lot of ways, I've always felt like it takes a year or two maybe to really get
Yeah.
to know an instrument. And one of the other bittersweet things about playing the oboe at times is seems like right when you get to know your instrument,
Yeah.
it's kind of on the downhill, right? And
Yeah.
you're already at that point starting to part with it and make plans for maybe another instrument. But so anyway, I still feel very much in the middle of my like discovery and you could say relationship with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I bought a Menig AM Albrecht Meyer model, and I've long been a fan of the Berlin Phil Digital Concert Hall. It's like
Yes.
I'm a huge classical music nerd, and whenever we're preparing a piece at the NSO, I like to go home and study various recordings and just, get in the mood of the piece. And so Albrecht Meyer, this is the instrument he designed and plays, and there's a lot of qualities that I admire about his playing. I'd say, namely, the sort of fullness and presence that he can achieve. That again seems like something that is a pretty universal struggle among oboists. I can't tell you how many times I've been, you work to make this reed that has a beautiful sound, and then you get to orchestra and someone says, like, I can't hear you, or, oboist, you sound great, but I'm going to need it, 150% louder. And so yeah, I picked up this oboe at John Simers in Philadelphia. He has a really good just selection of all different makes and models. And I first brought it home on trial before I committed to buying it. And my first experience was, wow, it was much, much, much more tight and contained and resistant than my usual oboe, which is a Howarth XL model, which I still love and I still play. I want to make that clear. I have so much appreciation, and I owe the guys at Howarth so much, because I think their oboes are wonderfully made, and especially for a second oboist or anyone who struggles with low note security, I can't think of a brand of oboe that has a more secure low range than the Howarth. Nice. So I still consider that very much part of my my setup, and I will switch between them just depending on what I'm playing. But back to the Menig, the first thing I noticed was, at least on the reeds I had been using for the Howarth, this oboe felt so tight, it almost blew back at me. Gotcha. And it was a bit jarring at first, but then I also took this approach, which I've been doing lately, and sort of a philosophical approach, but working from your conclusions backwards, I think can be a really, really powerful learning tool and teaching tool, and just way to orient yourself, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
So I assumed that there were inherently good qualities to this oboe. I noticed, for instance, basically no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the oboe, the tone that I made through this instrument, to sort of fracture and lose its sort of center focus. And I thought, hey, that's really interesting, because so much of our work in reed making is trying to build focus and containment into the reed. But then I thought to myself, well, what if you have an oboe that's way more contained than you thought an oboe could be? What would that allow? What would that afford you in your reed making? And I was also really inspired by one of my best friends who is a bassoonist, and we were colleagues at Juilliard, very much in the American school of bassoon playing. And he moved to Germany and totally relearned how to play his instrument. And for someone that got into Juilliard, graduated from Juilliard, you would think that comes with a certain degree of confidence or self-assuredness, or at least a clear concept that you can trust. But he really went through a process of unlearning everything he had learned and relearning a new style. And very much similarly, the from what I understand, I'm no bassoon expert. We can get some bassoonists in the chat who might call me out on this. But from what I understand, the newer Heckles are just bigger, heavier instruments that just require more air, a reed that can take more air, and it's kind of similar or analogous to what I felt when I tried this oboe, just a beefier, thicker instrument that required more of an input from the player or the reed or both. And he shared with me some of the cool things he learned through studying in Europe, and how embouchure and face is totally subservient to the wind. And they would practice sticking the entire reed in their mouth up to the thread for them or the
Mm.
wires for them, which would, basically be the staple for us. And they
Yeah, the
would
whole
just,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, the whole thing. And they would practice long tones starting from a pianissimo, crescendoing to a fortissimo and back with the whole reed in their mouth, which basically ensures that there's nothing your lips are doing to impact the reed. And this is not something I'd ever done, and I would encourage anyone that might try this to not be afraid if you
Yeah.
get some nasty, ugly, or whatever sounds that you're not used to,
Yeah.
because if you're not starting from this sort of first principles approach, your reeds or your setup or your instrument might not be geared for it.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I started just rethinking my reed philosophy to really um, allow me to use aspirated attacks with absolutely no embouchure, and tried to make something that, in that, again, working from conclusions backwards, I assumed, okay, I want to be able to sneak in predictably with the whole reed in my mouth, just to prove that I'm not using any embouchure and that it's all air. And I found myself contorting my support muscles and my diaphragm and my
Mm.
air, I guess, into a posture, let's say, that I wasn't necessarily used to. And it was a really useful learning experience for me. And kind of fast forwarding now, this oboe is broken in a bit. So in a sense, the oboe is kind of come taken a step towards me, but I've
Yeah.
also taken a step towards it in terms of, um, you know, accommodating that philosophy of playing that's more wind-based, let's say, and
Yeah.
maybe requires a reed that is built for a generally larger volume of air.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, if you don't mind, I go on another quick tangent.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm I think about these things very, very abstractly, and so I someone asked me, is I was explaining to a friend so that this instrument is much more resistant and takes much more air to really like fill up, let's say. And the friend logically concluded, oh, you must be using easier reeds now to compensate.
Mm.
And that's in a sense true, but there's this very interesting duality of my reeds now being much easier in some sense, but also much more resistant at the same time. And
Interesting. Yeah.
when I was kind of forced to really think about what that meant, what I've come down to is it's sort of about the committal of your air shapes.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is, on this instrument, which requires that larger volume of air, if I don't really know what shape of air I'm going to be playing, or what phrase I'm going to be playing, or where the phrase I'm about to start is going,
Mm.
you can run into a position where you're having to maybe use your embouchure to shape things, or compensate or strain yourself just because you didn't really prepare and have that commitment. But when you have a clear vision and commit to a piece of air, I find that the instrument almost plays itself. But it's this weird
Nice.
duality of, there's much more resistance in terms of how much you have to commit to playing it. But if you're very on top of doing that and willing and able or want to do that, you can kind of reach this place where the instrument feels very, very easy to play. I hope that makes some sense. I'm,
Yeah.
like I said, still figuring out my ideas and clarifying them myself. But
Yeah. No, I like that idea, and just like, yeah, that view of playing a lot. And I have been playing on a Loray standard board for a long time, since I
mhm,
started. And I just recently bought a B series copy, which,
cool.
to some degree allows me to kind of, in a similar way, use more air and not worry so much about the spreading of the tone. And there's something so freeing about that, right? You can just go, and breathe into the instrument. And
Right.
yeah. So now I'm really
Yeah.
curious to try. try one of your oboes. That's
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
awesome.
Well, it's I don't know. I do think that to a large degree the player changes the instrument. And so
Yeah,
um now that this instrument is very, very broken in, I don't know that it would be quite as shocking of a sort of a change, but
yeah.
it does in general. Another thing I might add is, let's see if you can, if it's quite visible here, but the pads on this oboe are quite
Yeah.
thick
Yeah, they are.
compared to the Howarth, which has much thinner cork pads. And I've also done an experiment where I basically lowered the key heights on most keys to as low as I can go without the note really blowing back at me so much that it was kind of unplayable.
Yeah.
Um, and so it was a really interesting experiment to basically equalize the resistances of top to bottom, all the notes on the oboe, um, and then kind of figure out how to shape things from that position, or how to make a reed from that position, because I don't know, the oboe can be notoriously sort of uneven in its scale. We
Yeah.
have very thin notes like B, middle B, C natural, where the effective tube length is very short. And
Yeah.
then anyway, I another thing that I've been enjoying about this Manig oboe is there's a few extra key height adjustment screws that are
Oh,
added
nice.
in that allow you to, for instance, just easily regulate the height of the F sharp key, which can raise or lower your low G, and also the high D,
Wow.
which is a sort of overtone of that G. And
Nice.
being able to really customize all of the key heights and notes is is I think a pretty useful part of the mechanism. You can drive
Yeah.
yourself crazy too.
Yeah.
You play one out of tune note or something, and you're inclined to just change your whole oboe because of it. But
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Have you
anyway,
always been kind of interested in adjusting oboes like that, or is that something you've learned recently?
um, I'd say that's something I've definitely, I'm really thankful of Elaine Duvas and Nathan
Mhm.
Hughes, teachers at Juilliard. They're both really experts of the mechanism, and while one can definitely get carried away, focusing too much on the mechanism just being perfect, at the end of the day, it is just a tool to make music with. But I will say
Mm.
that understanding the relationship between all the adjustment screws, being able to adjust your own oboe, I think is a skill most oboists should learn early on.
Yeah.
This mechanism looks so intimidating and so complex, and in some ways it is, and oboes
Mm.
are very finicky, but I think the sooner people, as oboists are learning or developing their skills, the sooner they have a good guide for this and develop the confidence to be able to take ownership of their oboe's adjustments, I do think it's a really important skill. And so I've been doing it for a while. And like I said, at a few times I've gotten myself into a pickle
Yeah.
because just based on how one read
Yeah.
feels one day, if I
Right.
keep getting annoyed at, um, a certain register or a certain note even being sharp
Yeah.
or flat, um, instead of assuming, well, that's just one day and one read and one piece, and tomorrow will
Yeah.
be another day. I'll just
Go
uh,
for it.
go for it,
Yeah.
and yeah, some level of prudence, I suppose, is
Yeah.
good to maintain.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I find that I have to really trust my reed before I start adjusting my elbow.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
best
so
best to make sure best to
yeah,
make sure the reed you're using when you're figuring out your intonation things is a reed that just feels generally comfortable, and a reed that you think you can make consistently too. That's another thing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
yeah, nice. And there definitely are, I know some younger students have asked before, but there are resources about adjusting oboes online, quite a number of them, and even some books and stuff. Is there any like resource that you used to learn?
let's see. So every year at Juilliard, we would have a pretty in-depth repair class or two,
Nice.
where both of the teachers would go through their methods for adjusting oboes. And associated with those classes were some handouts and pamphlets just detailing, a diagram of the oboe, detailing each screw and what it affects. I don't necessarily have access or the rights to
Yeah.
those diagrams
Mm.
for distribution or anything like that. But yeah, I also do think to some degree, you know, you can have as clear of an understanding of things theoretically as possible, and nothing is as good as just the experience of
Yeah.
turning the screws yourself and testing with some cigarette paper, maybe a little triangle of cigarette paper,
Yeah.
and figuring out yourself. But ideally for all people, not before your concert, and
Yeah.
hopefully
Yeah.
with someone trusted within
Yeah.
within reach. So
Yeah. Nice.
yeah.
Cool. Well, we had a couple of submitted questions. One of them was, what is your ideal second oboe read? Which is kind of a loaded question, but
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, the ideal
Yeah.
second oboe read is one that just does everything
Yeah.
perfectly
Perfectly.
and
Yeah.
more. And
Yeah.
um, so the way I that's a good question. And second oboe, I will say, now having two different second oboe jobs, there are definitely some just unique requirements and nuances to the job that that you don't necessarily run into um, when you're playing first oboe. I'd say first and foremost, the ability to play transparently and really
Mm.
kind of at a moment's notice back off either the air or the support or just the commitment to the note, let's say. You really want a read that can whisper in a sense, just
Nice.
because being able to melt into the texture and kind of fancy yourself a third clarinet when you need to be,
Yeah. Yeah.
and those Dvorak symphonies come around, that can be really important. And to achieve that, I find it's it's very important to pay special attention to how the corners and sides of the tip slope into the plateau and the rest of the reed. Um, I
Nice.
think sort of at the top of the rails area, almost on a microscopic level, I don't make reads with any sort of magnifiers, but I think I probably should. And I am constantly surprised and humbled by how how fine adjustments, how big of a difference fine adjustments can make, I should say, or a slightly different contour to that shoulder, top of the rail area,
Yeah.
sloping into the thin part of the tip. Um, I always find myself uh, scraping more than I need to, in a sense.
Mm.
I would say, what I've been learning or focusing on lately with my reed making is restraint and the patience and sort of faith to let the knife do the scraping. Like just
Yeah.
basically set the knife down on the cane, and your hand is only there to make sure the knife doesn't fall off the cane. But so many times, especially when you're, trying so hard to achieve something, you can really just unknowingly use a little bit of arm pressure or just kind of
Yeah.
scoop too much. And I find a lot of the times when my reeds fail, it's because I just scraped too much off when I was making an adjustment. And especially in this area I'm talking about, the kind of magic spot in terms of cushion and how the reed sort of takes the inception of the air, how the inception of the sound happens. In
Yeah.
this area, I would say don't underrate. Um, how am I trying to phrase this exactly? Always best to take a second to scrape a little, stop before you think you might be done,
Yeah.
and try it to confirm. Because I've just had experiences where the littlest bit that I think wouldn't, I'm not even sure I took cane off, and then I
Mm.
tried to read again, and it made it everything clicks into place. Another couple things. So the perfect second oboe read, I don't usually set out, first of all, to make second oboe reads. My second oboe reads usually just evolve from sort of a abstract first oboe read or principal oboe read that
Yeah.
I'm kind of trying to make every time I set out to make reads, because as it is, the reeds over time tend to weaken and
Mm.
sort of break down and soften as the cane stops holding as much water, and maybe you get those little micro fissures at the tip, hopefully
Yeah.
not too many. And just over a period of time playing a reed, I do find that they generally break in and soften, weaken. So for me, if I set out to just make in one sitting the most finished, whispering,
Yeah.
supple type of read, which, by the way, I think everyone should be able to do. I
Mm.
think that's a really useful skill. I think sometimes you might find yourself needing a read for tonight or needing a read for tomorrow. And if one's entire process relies on, a 5-day aging and curing, and
Yeah.
anyway, it's
Yeah.
and this is sort of an Elaine Dubas classic, but she just sits down and in 20 minutes she has a read from tying it. And for me, if I make my reads in one sitting, they tend to just never have all that much resilience or strength in the long run.
Mhm.
So I tend to just try to make kind of as beefy and full of a reed that plays a really full, like principal oboe solo sound.
Yeah.
And over the course of maybe a week or two, soaking it up a few times, practicing on it, touching base with it, doing these little micro, like I said, these micro adjustments here and there, really dialing things in, they kind of turn into the second oboe reads.
Nice.
So that's, I guess, if I had to focus on a couple things, it would be that spot, and then really taking your time to make the read. And yeah, kind of what I was talking about before in terms of, first of all, practicing aspirated attacks, because
Mm.
I think a lot of times we can compensate for improper air volume or support, whatever you want to call it. I'm using these terms somewhat interchangeably, but we can compensate for the support, let's say, not being there by, as we tongue the note, kind of involving the lips, involving the tongue, and just using that explosive nature of the tongue at times to make the sound start. Whereas if we're really comfortable and skilled at getting the sound to start in a situation like, with the whole reed in your mouth where you couldn't, even if you wanted to, use your
Yeah.
tongue or your lips to help it out, that's really, I think, sort of the fundamental ground layer of a good support. And this is something, if I'm being entirely honest, I feel like I'm just discovering now. I I've had a lot of experiences, I'd say primarily with Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto.
Mm.
For whatever
Okay.
reason, that one, the second movement, I think the second oboe only has 6 notes in it,
Mm.
and only 3 of them are scary. And it feels like once you get done with those 3 notes, like the whole piece is over and the whole concert is over, and you're like already feels already like you're decompressing on your couch
Yeah.
after those 3 notes are over.
So funny.
But I've and anyway, people can go listen to the second movement of the Emperor Concerto. But there's just a low F sharp, a low G, and then a low F sharp to end it that are impossibly slow, never quiet enough,
Mm.
never relaxed enough. And it's this weird dichotomous moment where you're putting as much care and focus and attention and stress about your reed being perfect and your support being perfect, and just giving the tiniest whisper of a sound out, yet the music is just the most lush, relaxed, spacious thing ever. And I've had a few, somewhat terrifying experiences where the concerts went fine, but I was just wound up into a ball and tight
Yeah.
and bracing and squeezing for those. And that's another contributing factor to my pursuing a way to just start notes with only air and with a relaxed posture and a relaxed face and a relaxed diaphragm, I guess. And
Nice.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, I've been really lately just pursuing how to play in that sort of settled, relaxed manner. So to wrap back around to the second oboe reed
Mhm.
question, I think handling that tip to rail transition is really important. And then finding and honing a skilled sort of um, uh, support posture so that you can start notes without relying on the tongue, without relying on the lips, the face, or even your reed being absolutely perfect. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I like that a lot. And do you find that like maybe you're kind of transferring some of the resistance that you would use in your support and your embouchure, even your air, like to an oboe that's more resistant and maybe a reed that is matches that as well, like kind of putting it there rather than internalizing it?
I'd say so. I'd say so. There is, to some degree, uh, to a limited degree, yes.
Okay, yeah,
I think, the oboe and the reed and the body, it's a system where there needs to be some point of resistance. And I would
yeah,
say that on this oboe and on my current reeds, there's more of the resistance um, placed at the oboes, under the oboe's responsibility, let's say. But I would say that having, I think ideally one should find an inner resistance as well,
yeah,
which is a really abstract concept that's hard to pin
yeah,
down and describe physiologically.
yeah,
But basically, I I try to never let 100% of the resistance be sort of piling up at the reed or at the oboe, because I think whenever you're at the complete edge,
mhm,
um, from an aesthetic standpoint, musically, tone color wise, you never want to be in a position where you can't go any further in one direction.
yeah,
So I think that's maybe the purpose of the inner resistance, whatever we want to call it, is to make sure that we're never in a position where we're just maxed out at the wall, at sort of um, a wall of resistance.
yeah,
And so I think for the listener too, um, the best performers seem to just have an effortless ability to always have another trick up their sleeve or always have another gear, um,
yes,
and sounding at your limit. I don't think, perhaps there are limited edge cases musically, if something is
yeah,
supposed to sound absolutely brash and nasal and
yeah,
um, but I'd say ideally the kind of baseline setup should already be at that point.
nice. Yeah, that's fantastic advice. Yeah, cool. One other submitted question. How has the climate in DC affected your remaking? How does it compare to San Diego?
Yeah, so in San Diego, where you basically have one season, which is perfect, beautiful, not too
Yeah,
hot, not too dry, summer-ish conditions. In DC, we have four pretty distinct seasons, with the summer being characteristically muggy and
Mm.
swampy, let's say.
Yeah.
So we actually in the NSO as well play a number of concerts out on the Capitol lawn
Mm.
outdoors, and we'll do a Memorial Day concert, a Fourth of July concert, and a lot of those concerts can be 95 degrees and 95% humidity. And
Wow.
so oftentimes that can be a little bit difficult to navigate because the reeds can start to feel soggy and over-soaked. Um,
Yeah.
and actually the heat can cause you to be the pitch to climb quite a bit at the same time. And that
Mm.
combination of having what feels like a really unruly flat setup and actually kind of being sharp, it can be challenging at times. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's you're cringing just because that's
Yeah.
talk about being in a place where you feel like you can't go in any direction or something.
Right. Yeah.
So I would say the sort of counterfactual to that horrible situation I just outlined is the fact
Hmm.
that with so much humidity, your old beaten up reeds from the winter that had no opening kind of come back to life a little bit.
Okay. Nice.
So I'd say when it gets really hot and muggy, the the reeds can take longer to break in and settle down just because they're not ever really drying out so much.
Yeah.
Perhaps one of those humidity controlled reed cases would be a good idea. That's not
Yeah.
one, it's not something that I have right now. But in the winter, when it gets cold, like we're just coming out of right now, I was finding that um, I needed to just make a setup, make a read with more opening to start out with, because they would inevitably on day two just soak up,
Mm.
half of what they seemed like they
Yeah.
offered on day one. So, you know, as oboists, it's a constantly changing environment, and the reeds and the cane is kind of changing every day. So being in DC is just kind of it feels like that with some pretty extremes, some pretty extreme conditions on the summer and winter front. But
Yeah.
overall, you find a way to manage. And I think the best thing, honestly, is just to always have sort of a pipeline. I kind of described how at first I'm trying to make a full solo principal oboe read, let's say, when I first make the read. Um, and while I'm making it and breaking it in, it might be something that's so big and unruly, sort of,
Mm.
that it isn't necessarily so usable in anything except for maybe practicing some long tones or scales or
Yeah.
trying to do some weight training, let's say.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
then, you have the reads that maybe feel like that, but settle down and you could play if you needed to step in a principal role. And then you have the reads, and this is just me speaking, but my more second oboe, maybe like recital or solo recording audition reads, let's say, that are all a little bit more on the broken down, supple side. I think it's just really good to have at least a few examples in all three of those buckets, let's say.
Nice. Yeah.
Um, just so you're never hung out to dry. And if the weather were to change or the seasonality, the
Hmm.
humidity, temperature were to change, um, you'd have options. So
Nice.
let's
Yeah.
just try.
That's
How do I try to navigate that?
yeah. That helps a lot. Yeah. Awesome. Someone just submitted a question. What tips do you have for learning to recenter your tone to a different pitch, like 440, 441, or 442?
Yeah, well, let's see. That's something I definitely had to work on when I started this job
Yeah.
a couple of years ago, just because in San Diego we played at 440. Um, at Juilliard it's technically 441, um, and then being at 442 here. So for centering the tone, that's a bit I'm pausing a moment because in a sense, the tone should be centered optimally for wherever the reed wants to be and wherever your body is relaxed. And it's sort of a position and a way of playing that one I think could maintain over a period of time and not get
Yeah.
tired. And
Yeah.
um, so I'm definitely not trying to dodge the question. I'm just trying to think about how to best answer it
Yeah.
because, in a sense, I would approach it. I kind of have this vision of what a centered tone should feel and sound like. And then if I'm not sort of at the pitch, I would probably aim to change staple length, shape, even reed length
Yeah.
to sort of counteract that. Um, I will say that, and perhaps this is just an air thing, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why this oboe has more resistance. Because I think this oboe was designed roughly for 442 or 443.
Mm.
Um, and I would say perhaps to get up to a higher pitch level, it requires a larger volume of air or a sharper oboe to some degree. Um, and, I think we've all had the experience of, depending on the day, depending on the reed, sort of blowing our oboe up or down.
Hmm.
But I do think the instrument has a point and a general pitch level where it is at its most resonant. And I think
Yeah.
the reed as well has a has a place on the reed and a general vibrating frequency and like baseline, especially if you have a nice tight seal from top to bottom. I think that's, some people call pitch floor. I think
Yeah.
the reed should have built in this sort of optimal resonating pitch level. And I think just coming back to like working from your conclusions backwards, um, find the reed and the oboe that naturally want to sit there and that allow you to play in a relaxed, comfortable manner. But that's going to require a lot of self experimentation, a lot of
Yeah.
personal work to, you know, find what that air posture, I like to call it, is.
Yeah.
Um, and that's going to be somewhat different for every person. But I will say that along the sort of committal line that I was talking about before, where this oboe plays really easily and really freely, but only if I really commit to the air shapes I'm going to make.
Yeah.
Whereas I think my Howarth and I think perhaps playing at a lower pitch level allows you to kind of back off and maybe use a bit more of a passive
Mm.
airstream, which I'm not using passive and committal as like good or bad. I think there's there are definitely situations where you want to employ both. And I think on the ideal oboe and reed and setup, you should be able to play somewhat passively, especially as a second oboist.
Yeah.
But um, anyway, I'm talking a bit in circles here, and
No. No.
I'm not sure I so directly answered the question. But um, I mean, I think one of the easiest ways to reach another pitch level is to change staple length, and
Yeah.
I think it's really not if you have a variety of shaper tips or tie lengths or the ability to change those variables around. I think staple length could be a very natural thing to change.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I
So
think I often think of like the centering of tone being related to kind of that inner resistance, like you were talking about, that like inner focusing of the air. Um,
yeah,
yeah. So I think, like you're saying, that that should be the baseline kind of, and then the pitch you can kind of adjust in other ways. Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, just really quickly, I'm looking at I wrote a list of things that I've maybe discovered or been playing
Yeah.
around with on this new oboe.
Awesome.
And one of them was, and I was, as American oboists, generally speaking, we shy away from forked F.
Yes.
And, you know, in a lot of cases and situations, the tone color doesn't necessarily match. Oftentimes it's horribly out of tune, either
Mm.
stuffy or it just, it's kind of uh, it's, I don't know, no one seems to be the biggest fan of it. But
Yeah.
on this oboe, the forked F is actually very centered and very full,
Oh,
although it still has quite a different color from the regular F. And I've been really experimenting with thinking about them not as like, oh, regular F or right hand, or this F is the standard, and this one is the bad compromise we make when we're
yeah.
playing a technical passage. I've actually found, and maybe it's just the oboe or the reeds or the air or whatever, but I found a way of playing and sort of orienting my setup where this forked F feels um, really resonant, really full, and actually speaks with. It's much easier to fill the note up with air, if that makes sense. The note starts kind of vibrating and sounding full from with a much lower threshold than the regular F, being a bit more resistant, having a bit more cushion, and the regular F is just more. It's a very powerful note. I think
Yeah.
even
Quite
on most
present.
most
Yeah.
people's oboes most people would agree with that. And so I frequently, depending on the shape of the musical line and the context of the piece, I feel extremely comfortable in both low and upper second octave, I guess, thumb octave. I feel really comfortable using the forked F not as a bad compromise, but
Mm.
as like just another color on the color palette that can at times be much preferable for the air shape you'll want to use for whatever phrase you're playing.
Yeah.
Especially, I'm thinking of maybe a phrase that ends with sort of an appoggiatura G resolving down to F,
Yeah.
and with just the regular F, which can oftentimes be a lot more direct of a sound and present than the note G.
Mhm.
Um, I think your air at times will have to do some sort of acrobatics to like bridge the gap between those two notes and have the G heard as more present than the F. You'll have
Yeah.
to extra pump up the G, make sure you're, backing off for the F, but not doing it in such a jarring way that causes the legato to disappear.
Yeah.
And instead, if you have an F fingering like this forked F that naturally sounds full and resonant with less air, it seems like a prime situation to me to take that opportunity to it seems like the note itself kind of matches the air shape I wanted to make anyway. Um, and so that's just another thing that I've been playing around with. I mean, I always would watch Digital
Nice.
Concert Hall and see the oboist using forked F for almost everything, and I thought it was
Yeah.
like bizarre and strange, and
Yeah.
it made no sense to me. I didn't even know what it would feel like to think of forked F as like a normal
Right.
F. But I feel like to some degree I've had that experience, and now it just seems like another option that's a good option.
Nice.
So yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I like
and I'll I guess throw in for all the second oboists out there.
yeah.
Um, the I'm and people have various opinions on this, and this isn't what I'm about to suggest isn't something to be abused or to be a crutch, but I do find on a lot of oboes that adding the low B key to a low F, especially a forked F, or a low E flat or something like that, can act as a really effective mute and add some nice healthy resistance that can sometimes when you're trying to play quietly, especially on a powerful note like F, the sheer like direct quality and loud
Yeah.
quality, present quality of that note can put you in sort of a bind or a sticky
Mm.
situation. And for instance, in Dvorak's Seventh Symphony, which is a famous second oboe excerpt on a lot of auditions.
Mm.
I'll play the opening phrase, and then the second phrase starts on an F, but marked down a dynamic. And oftentimes I'll either employ forked F or forked F plus B key to achieve a really different sort of sound world there. And at least in my opinion, I think if these things, like I said, aren't used as a crutches, but
Yeah.
thought of as extra colors on your
Yeah.
palette, I think they can totally be used for good effect. So
Yeah, definitely. And like you're saying, not having to do so much acrobatics with your air, and you're focusing on for sure all of that. Why not, employ these tactics when you need
yeah,
them? Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Harrison, thank you so much for joining me. I really learned a lot and I really enjoyed hearing about everything you're doing. Yeah, and thank you so much for everything you gave us today.
yeah, thank you, Logan. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I really appreciate the podcast you're doing,
Yeah.
and this is a really fun opportunity to answer some questions and really really refine my own ideas on some of these things. And
Awesome.
I, a couple months ago, was doing some reed making live streams and plan to do a few more. So I guess if anyone wants to give me a follow, if anything I've said resonates with you, or if anyone has more personal questions, love discussing these ideas and sharing some of the things I've been thinking about. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I look forward to more of your live streams. That'll be fun.
Thanks. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
All right, yeah, take care.
All right. Bye, everyone.